Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of this year's annual Knowledge Forum. So far this week, we've spoken to you about how to set up for success, how to build and maintain the correct infrastructure internally to allow you to maximise the value of the report and support platform, and how to engage stakeholders around the institution and leverage the support the system offers to further its use, appeal, and awareness. Yesterday, we sat down with Birmingham City University and the University of Manchester to discuss supporting marginalised student communities and heard about the fantastic work that is being done within those institutions to provide students who are more at risk of facing harassment to get access to help and support that is tailored to their needs. My colleague Kenya then had a really interesting conversation with Tolu Ajayi, who is a Manchester-based activist and organiser who spoke with Kenya about his work at the LGBT Foundation and within the wider community that aim to elevate, celebrate and liberate LGBT plus people of colour in the Greater Manchester region. Their discussion on how we can move from consultation to collaboration with students was incredibly useful for the partners that attended. So if you didn't manage to catch either of yesterday's sessions, they have been recorded and will be shared with you at the end of the Knowledge Forum. Today, we are talking about my favourite subject, which is anonymous data. I'm going to spend some time now talking about why anonymous data is so powerful and what you should be aiming to use the data you get through report and support to achieve. I'll then be joined by Sarah Sievers from Goldsmiths University of London and Nicola Campbell from the University of York, who will be talking about how they're using anonymous data in practice to affect change. Firstly, though, I just want to make a note on language. So often the default language is to use anonymous reporting. However, I want to be really intentional in talking about disclosures, as this encompasses the majority of cases we're talking about when we at Culture Shift reference anonymity. An anonymous disclosure isn't a formal report and does not usually involve disciplinary action by nature of it being anonymous. And the reported party, if named, isn't typically held to account by an anonymous disclosure. However, that doesn't mean that the action can't be taken, which is what I'll be talking to you about today. Anonymity is the first step on the survivor journey for many victims of harassment and inappropriate behaviour. We know from organisations that have worked with victim survivors that take a survivor-centric approach to tackling harassment, that allowing anonymous disclosures is a way for victim survivors to communicate before they might be ready to reveal who they are. It gives survivors of traumatic events the freedom to express and let go part of their pain. It can give them the knowledge that they might be saving someone else experiencing that behaviour and potentially hope that it could stop. This quote was taken from the Fawcett Society report, which was written and published earlier this year when they looked at tackling harassment within the workplace. However, we know that this also really rings true with students and staff in higher education, and we know this through the data. When we look at the data across all users of report and support, we're still seeing a high percentage of people choosing to make an anonymous disclosure. 47% of people have found the courage to speak up when they probably wouldn't have if they weren't protected by anonymity. As a sector, this is information, data and insight that you wouldn't have access to without permitting anonymous disclosures. It just allows you to understand your culture and any problem areas much better than if you didn't allow it. We are going to be talking more about this and about what they've sort of learned from their annual reporting when we speak to UCL tomorrow. But I did just want to dive into a little case study that we've put together when we've compared their year 1 published annual report and their year 2 annual report. So this shows that in year 1, so I should say that UCL have got a population of staff and students of about just over 60,000. In year 1, they received just under 400 reports total, And in year 2, they received just over 300 reports total. And the thing that always I think is really insightful to see is the fact that in year 1, 65.4% of those reports were anonymous reports. In year 2, you can see that that moves to in the right direction, in my opinion, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. That moves to 53.1% of the reports through the system were anonymous, and 46.9% were requests for advisors. There's a lot of purple on that, on those graphs, right? And that is just so much information about your culture and about this, you know, this about UCL's culture that they wouldn't have known had they not allowed anonymous reporting. Most systems, I would say, at the end of their anonymous reporting route, ask the reporter the question why they've decided to report anonymously today. And we've looked at this data sort of across the whole reporting estate of all of our 80 clients. But this specifically is what UCL reported in their annual reports of the top reasons that people choose to remain anonymous, and they are consistent, and it's really interesting how consistent they are across all of our partners. So number 1 reason is that they are worried about retaliation. Number 2 is that they would be worried that it might affect their current or future career. Number 3 is that they were worried that nothing would be done if I told someone. Number 4 is that they're worried about being called a troublemaker. Number 5, which is really disappointing but gives us something to work with, is that they've told a colleague but they didn't take it seriously, so they didn't think anyone else would. And number 6 is that they were worried that they wouldn't be believed. Now, this again gives us so much information to be able to start to earn people's trust. That it also gives us the opportunity to really look at the educating staff and students about report and support, so that people can be signposted in the right direction of report and support. So that, you know, I told a colleague and they didn't take it seriously, that's a big sign to start addressing your, you know, first responder training, and really use that to educate people, so that over time we see these you know, we see the trust earned, the anonymous reports become less and less, and the named reports become higher and higher. But I'll talk about that more in a second. This is a quote from Graham Towell, which was taken from his interview in our Exceeding Expectations 2.0 handbook. In the interview, Graham explains that for the sector to be considered to be performing well, we need to get to a place where there is low prevalence but high reporting. So we need to be in a place where incidents of harassment aren't happening as often, but when they are, people are feeling empowered to report it. And that's not something that's going to happen overnight. This is a rough illustration of what you would hope to see in reporting. In fact, what you should hope to see, and what we are seeing from the data, is a process. So first, institutions begin to build up reports over time, with both named and anonymous reports growing, and with anonymous reports sitting slightly ahead of the named. As time passes, the total number of reports should grow, but with a bigger gap between the number of named reports and anonymous disclosures. To achieve this, we must act on reports that we've received to build and earn trust. We need to encourage people to speak up and give people the confidence that reporting is worthwhile, not just on named reports, but on the behaviours and cultures that are being spoken out about anonymously too. The trend after the dotted line is where you want to be getting to, seeing a drop-off in anonymous reports, but those numbers being made up in named reports, so still receiving a consistently high level of disclosures. In tomorrow's session with UCL and Warwick, you'll start to see also how this ambition is being made a reality with some of our partners who are a bit further along the process with report and support. So, how do you start to move along that journey? How do you continue to increase reports overall? How do you give your community the confidence to make more named reports so they can receive real effective help? It's all about making sure that you're taking the data you're getting and using that to drive action. As I said before, shortly I'll be speaking to Sarah from Goldsmiths and Nicola from the University of York to show you some real life examples of what action is looking like within institutions. But before we get onto that, I'll just talk you through a little of what that looks like in principle. So you can hopefully walk away today with a checklist of actions you can take and 2 fantastic case studies putting some of this advice into practice. At Culture Shift, we see free text boxes within anonymous disclosures as a huge enabling factor to take meaningful action. Victims of harassment or witnesses reporting on someone else's behalf make reports because they want to be heard. Free text boxes help you to get a full story, not just the narrative that you're expecting. These 3 points are things to reflect on in terms of how you're utilising the information being given to you through free text boxes. Number 1 is to understand. Free text boxes allow you to truly understand the experiences of reporting parties. Your report form comprises a set of questions that help you to identify and define the behaviours occurring on your campus. The reporting party can select the responses that align most closely with their experience, but this means that the answers you will get will always sit within your existing understanding of how harassment is being experienced by individuals. But take, for example, the recent spiking claims that were sweeping the nation in the news. Within your existing questions, would it even have been possible for students to let you know that they thought this spiking was being administered by an evil? Allowing free text boxes means that you're not restricted by the parameters of your existing knowledge. You only know to ask the questions that you know to ask. Number 2 is collaborate. Secondly, secondly, what this allows you to do is then access your method of collecting data. Are the questions you're asking relatable? By creating a 2-way dialogue, you open up the opportunity for disclosing parties to shape the system, let you know the language that they use to describe their experiences, and building on one of the themes of yesterday, this allows you to co-create the reporting and support process. Disclosing parties then have an opportunity to let you know what they believe that an acceptable outcome is. If you're not sure of what action looks like, you can come up with these solutions together. The only important thing here is communicating clearly what is and is not possible. On screen here, you can see a really great example of keeping communication clear throughout the process so that you're setting realistic expectations. Number 3 is that we need to ensure accurate data representation. Because harassment can be subtle, it can be difficult to identify, and it can also be intrinsically linked to behaviours we've normalised or have been taught are normal for so long that the individual might not know how to identify their experience. What this can lead to is the miscategorisation of incident types. Coming soon within our system, you'll have the ability within your CMS to recategorize support so that your data is as accurate as possible. Of course, in order for this to happen, you not only need to allow free text boxes, but also commit to reviewing your data. So this is one of the questions that I'll be putting to our panel in just a moment. Have you had a named individual in an anonymous report, and what do you do? Sarah's got a great big grin on her face there because she gets asked this question all of the time. But before I talk to our panel about that, let's look at the options. There are 4 general steps that you can consider around these types of disclosures. Number 1 is to assess the risk of the behaviour from happening again. Number 2 is to investigate if necessary. This might not be an investigation into an individual, and if it is, it needs to be decided on a case-by-case risk assessed basis. Number 3 is maintaining data on events that appear to be a problem, or individuals or departments or faculties that appear to be repeating sort of offending inappropriate behaviour, means that you're not starting every report from scratch. Knowing that this behaviour could be possible in the past can really help influence your decision making when looking to take action. Number 4, communicate how you intend to or may act upon anonymous disclosures so that your process is as transparent as possible. When it comes to taking action on anonymous disclosures, I think one of the knee-jerk reactions is to fear complexity around taking action against a named perpetrator when the disclosing party is anonymous. However, this is rarely the action that you need to take, and discipline is almost an extreme scenario. What you need to do is take action that is proportionate to the perceived risk of the case. This is why the first step is always around assessing risk. If you're a Gold Package member working with Culture Shift, then you'll know that the risk assessment built into your CMS allows you to assess cases by measuring the likelihood of an event happening, the severity of it, and where it does occur, or were it to occur. This helps you understand that what you might need to do. What you need to do is have a list of potential actions available to you, communicate what these actions could be in a clear way upfront, and make sure that you're taking at least some action on these reports. This action could look like things like prioritizing your strategy, looking at how the data impacts funding decisions, assessing how you're collecting data and asking questions, look at how you're educating the people within your community by campaigning or offering training. Does the data indicate that you need to review your policy or how you communicate your policy? I'll go on to talk in a minute about environmental investigations, but this is intervention and culture change programs, targeted education, compulsory modules, targets and localized accountability. Communication is vital so that disclosing parties are also aware of the wide spectrum of action that their disclosure could lead to. I'm just going to jump back into that UCL case study to really hammer the point home. These are the incident types that have been reported year 1 and year 2, so that you can see that the behaviour is reported as overwhelmingly bullying, then harassment, and then sexual misconduct. But just to kind of give you a deep dive into the kind of things that I was talking about earlier so that you can understand specific behaviours, this is the kind of these are the words that reporters used in their free text boxes that just gives so much information about what it is specifically that's going on in your communities. So with bullying, you can see, I mean, like all of those different words that fall under bullying that have come from the people reporting. When it comes to harassment, there's just such a broad range of the kinds of harassment that people are reporting. And when it comes to sexual misconduct, which I think is a very, HR-y word, this really puts into perspective and brings to life the actual experiences of people at the end of sexual misconduct, abuse of power, unwanted contacts of behaviour, triggering statements, transphobia, online stalking, rape, hacking. We wouldn't know these specific behaviours had we not allowed people to use their own words when reporting. These are some of the actions that UCL have taken as a result of the reports that have been made. And the one, there's a couple actually that I really want to hone in on. The demystifying report and support presentations delivered to staff, I think, are a really important thing to do consistently and persistently throughout the years, every single year, not just at Welcome Week. And it's the benefit of those is kind of twofold. You are talking to two audiences, really. First of all, you're maybe three audiences. You are educating people on the fact that the system exists in the first place. Then you're potentially talking to potential victim survivors and helping manage their expectations of what the reporting process is and what could potentially happen next. You're also flagging to potential perpetrators that there is a system in place for those voices to be heard, and it's a preventative measure, hopefully, if anything else. Also, the fact that UCL updated their prevention of bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct policy. I can't remember which organisation it was that did a deep dive into the policies at I know what it was. It was part of the Al Jazeera podcast when they looked at how you would make a report and what policy, people are signposted to when they've experienced sexual misconduct. And it turned out that it was very, very hard to find, difficult to understand, and generally behaviour fell under lots of different policies, which isn't helpful when you are a survivor wanting to tell someone that something has happened. So the fact that UCL are continuing to review and adapt, and that bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct policy is a living, breathing document that potentially gets updated when they learn more, is really important thing. It's not just a dusty piece of paper that's kept in the filing cabinet that we only roll out when something really bad has happened. It's got to be a living, breathing, reviewed document. The other thing that they've done is the introduction of the environmental investigation process. Now, we have written and done a couple of webinars on that process, which you can find on the insights page of the Culture Shift website. But this is an investigation process where there have been a cluster of anonymous reports of poor behaviour or problematic culture where the institution has done a deep dive within that department or school, and I know that I'll be asking them more about it tomorrow. And I think, Sarah, you've done some environmental investigations as well, so we can talk about it in a moment. But those are so useful of like actual tangible action that you can take off the back of anonymous information. So I want to come to tackle the big, hairy question that everyone to an institution is worried about. I want to understand how many vexatious you as an institution have actually received in the last year. So you should have seen a poll pop up onto your screen. So and this is not just through report and support, this is total reports that are found to be vexatious throughout any reporting route that was potentially escalated to an investigation. So is it 0, 1 to 3, 4 to 5, or over 6? Don't actually know how I see the result. I think it'll pop up in a minute.
We've had about half of the people on the call respond, so we'll just give it another couple of seconds and then I'll close the poll.
Okay. Okay. Okay, that's interesting. So 42%, nearly half of you haven't received any. 26% received between 1 and 3. 11% received 4 to 5, and 21% received over 6. Okay, that's really interesting. Are vexatious reports something you worry about? Are we going to do another poll here? Okay. Okay. 33% said yes and 67% said no, which is really interesting because I was expecting 100% of you to say yes, because it's literally the number one question we're asked at Culture Shift. So the reports and the data from numerous studies show that very few reports are actually vexatious. And it's not really something that you, our partners, tell us is a problem that you are worried about or that actually happens in reality. So firstly, when you receive an anonymous disclosure, respect it. The likelihood that it is a call for help, support, or change from your community, and it's your responsibility to do something with that information. Okay, I'm going to invite the panelists to join me now, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined this morning by Sarah Sievers from Goldsmiths, University of London, and Nicola Campbell from the University of York. Good morning.
Hello.
Morning.
Hi, are you okay?
Good, thank you.
Good, excellent. All right, so Sarah, I'll come to you first. Can you tell us a little bit about why Goldsmiths decided to allow anonymous disclosures to be made and how much the feature is being used at your university?
Okay, that actually predated me a little bit. We had a change manager in place who a lot of you will be familiar with, who was Vicky Bars, who is now with UCL. She was really excellent in implementing report and support, but the discussions about anonymous reporting have always continued under review. And we're huge supporters of it for several reasons. It allows people, well, victim survivors or reporting parties, to use their own language, to use their own, and I mean, sometimes literally, if they're reporting and they're a second language speaker, there is nothing to stop them from using their first language in that kind of free text box. It's also a kind of protective measure. If someone's had an extremely traumatic event and they are ready to express themselves to someone, it's like breaking the seal. I think I say this often, it can be a therapeutic process. And it's the start of them dealing with something that will be with them possibly their entire lives. So it gives them more agency over how they start to communicate that with people. It's not always a call for action. Sometimes it is, and I think later on in this discussion, we'll talk about what that looks like and why people need that option to start with anonymity and perhaps follow up with a named report. We do look at it and review it and consider it repeatedly through the year. Some of you will recall, I'm so sorry, I can't recall which university she was from, but Heather Smells, who participated in Knowledge Exchange. Sorry, where was she from?
She was from Leicester.
Leicester, excellent. She's now with Lime Culture, I believe, but she had a really excellent system. We had totally differing opinions on the subject of anonymity and use of things like free text box. And because I think they kind of go hand in hand, but I'm sure again we'll get to that later. And one of the things that they did at Leicester is they had a question at the bottom of their reporting form that asked why people chose to make a report. And the top answer that they got is, I just wanted to tell my story. And I think that speaks volumes. So sometimes anonymity allows people to just say what they need to say at the beginning of a process.
Definitely, thank you. Nicola, I'm going to ask you the same question. Why did the University of York decide to allow anonymous disclosures to be made, and how much is it a feature that's used at York?
Yeah, so in terms of how it came to be allowed as a system, it was a bit of a journey. So our student union petitioned the university back in 2018, and the reality was that they petitioned an empty seat. So there was nobody in any kind of role like this. And I started the job to a petition saying, please, can we have anonymous reporting? And that was my welcome to higher education. So moving forward to now, obviously we have report and support, but to get there, it was very much a kind of a risk benefit conversation with senior management. All of the identified concerns that you imagine, vexatious reports, being overwhelmed with reports, all of the fears were there. And what we really had to work quite hard to do was to point out that the benefit was much, much bigger. So just from a starting point of listening to the student voice, it was what our students wanted. We also really quickly identified a value of just wanting to be transparent and encourage people to talk to us. And we didn't feel like we were doing that without anonymous reports. But also because of all of the reasons that as an ongoing benefit in terms of being able to shape our campaigns, so actually understanding what our students were worried about, as well as what we could investigate in typical terms. We've been able to really shape our messages, what we spend money on in terms of posters around campus, deciding where security should be on a night. So we've been able to do some really practical things on situations that we have absolutely no power to investigate, but we have been able to do that bit that Gemma sort of referenced about being seen to do something, where in the past it would have been investigation or nothing. And I think the bottom line on the risks is that they're real. The risks do exist, but we haven't come across anything that wasn't manageable and that wasn't worth it. And more than anything, I don't think there was any risk greater than continuing to just do things the old way. And actually the risk of not knowing what was going on was bigger than anything that we've actually come across.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, that the risk of not knowing is worse than handling those risks of what could happen. Would you both mind discussing the action that you've been able to take using the data insight gleaned specifically through anonymous reports? I'll come to you first, Nicola.
Yeah, so I think the surprising thing for us was actually the amount of levels at which we've been able to take action. So from a really strategic perspective, we've been able to use our data insights to basically grow the team and make sure that the university is now resourced to handle those sort of disclosures. So as I say, we've gone from an empty chair and a wish to now a team of 7 about to become 8 people. So we are actually now very confident in our response, and we've been able to build that by showing this data to senior management and saying, look at the things that are happening on campus, look at the fears that our students do have. So the significant increase of being able to employ SVLOs, 2 full-time investigators, as well as the time resource of things like rolling out bystander intervention programs, investing in programs like Consent Matters, the online consent module. So just justifying investing time and money into this agenda. Another more just day-to-day example of anonymous reports is ones where, again, we might not be able to do a typical classic investigation into student misconduct, but we had a situation where, for those that don't know, York is a very open campus, very picturesque. People come and walk the dogs here. And so we have any number of people just strolling through the campus day and night. And we had a bout of anonymous reports from our international students saying that they were being racially abused on campus, but none of them wanted to come forward and tell us who they were. But from every anonymous report that was made, it was like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. And we started being able to piece together what was happening. And actually, by the time we had some locations and some times and put security in certain places and assess some CCTV, we actually really quickly identified that it wasn't our students, it was actually a pack of local youngsters. And we got the police involved and actually ended up with a really public outcome to be able to say, because our students came and told us that this was happening, we were able to resource the issue, look at the issue, and make sure that the appropriate authority did respond. So again, in another sense, we did nothing in the typical investigation under our regulations, but we were able to resolve the problem because of the data that we were able to take anonymously.
That's amazing. That's just such incredible tangible action that you were able to take, but also the feedback loop and closing that feedback loop is just, you know, so important. And the fact that you were, you know, students will have seen that action taken and know that that action was taken, and that will only have a positive effect on earning that trust of staff and students. So that's a fantastic case study. I'm really pleased that that had a positive outcome. It's interesting that none of them were there was something that worried them about putting their name to that report. And so the fact that you got that cluster of anonymous information and were able to take such action is just, you know, that's just so positive, and it's such a you know, underlines the benefits really of doing it. Sarah, what action have you been able to take at Goldsmiths using the data and insight from anonymous reporting?
Quite a bit, and again, like Nicola, there were levels. I think that people's greatest fear is that they'll get very individualized reports calling out a named individual in an anonymous report, essentially named accused, and that they'll be expected to take action. And we do get those requests, and I think it's important to talk about that. And we probably will again down the line.
Forever.
Where we have things that have been more acute. I know that in the early days of report and support, we found that we were getting anonymous reports that led us to an environmental investigation of a department. And again, this is hugely valuable information. And I don't think we would have known about any of it if we were expecting people to put their names to individual reports, because then it would have looked like isolated cases. And if an investigation procedure had sprung out of that, again, it would look like one person's issue with their tutor or one other person inside the department. What we were actually getting was information, pieces of information from everybody who made a report that showed a cultural issue. And we were able to address that directly and really examine where things were going wrong, why people were being discouraged from participating fully, where there were issues of prejudice. And, you know, we talked yesterday in yesterday's sessions, for anyone who attended, a lot about intersectionality. And I think this is also a great benefit of anonymous reporting, that not everyone has trust in a system. Not everyone has a sense that they will be believed. And if they have compound identities that maybe drive them to be more likely to be singled out as a victim, survivor, then they feel less confident to come forward and talk about their experience, because they feel that the weight of that blame may be turned back on them. So I think that's hugely important.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicola, I want to ask specifically about the shift you've seen in reporting types. I think there's been a decrease in the number of anonymous reports over time at York. Do you see this being as a result of the action taken from the anonymous reports that you've received?
Yeah, so we have just run our first annual report, having had a full academic year's worth of data. And one of the things that we noticed, having stripped out the COVID misconduct data, which skewed our figures quite hugely, having decided to let people report those sort of issues through the system. But once we looked at the rest of what our students were getting up to, we noticed that actually the reporting levels were incredibly consistent, but that from one term to another, we had, in one case, 77 anonymous reports in one term, and then the following term only 44. But the overall level of reports stayed the same. And what we were able to look at on those 2 terms is that was the same 2 times that we'd introduced the question, why are you reporting anonymously? So again, this is a great piece of work. I can't remember who initially did it, but I know a lot of us have taken it on since, to understand why anonymous, why don't you want to tell us who you are? And it was a really vulnerable question to ask. I think it's fair to say it's incredibly difficult to be faced with people telling you things like, I don't trust you, I don't think the university cares about me, I don't think anyone's going to believe me or anyone's going to do anything. And they're hard questions to get feedback from, but they have been some of the most important questions that we've asked students. And what we've been hugely encouraged by at York is actually the decrease in some of the concerning ones. So people saying, I don't think you're going to do anything, has been one of our most significant decreases term on term. So I think, again, we can look at that and reasonably conclude that people are starting to trust that we are going to do something. And actually, the ones that remain high are really interesting ones, like, I think this is going to affect my future career, which obviously we can sit on this side of a table and say, obviously it won't do that. But there's something there again about currently we're looking at how do we shape our messaging better to say, it's not going to do that, we won't let it do that, and you don't need to worry about that. So those bits of learning, as much as we're able to give ourselves what we hope is a rightful pat on the back to say there are things that do show an increase in confidence, the fact that people are coming forward, but also things that we're still learning from. And I think the other thing in terms of the shift is what we're seeing is a lot of people who are submitting what looks like on the surface a duplicate report, but where they're just putting in one report anonymously, and then within very short timeframes are coming back to us and saying, actually, I am ready to tell you who I am, which again, I think really speaks to the increasing confidence that there is.
That's really good. That's a bit that when we first started Culture Shift, and when we first started working, with the University of Manchester, that was a bit that part of the survivor's journey, which is because I've lost control, through what has happened to me, I want to get a little bit of control back by retaining some of the information and like keeping my anonymity. But when you see that trend of people coming back and being prepared to put their name to it, I just feel like that bit of the survivor journey cannot be ignored, because I would argue that if they hadn't done that first bit, they would never get to the second bit, and that carrying that trauma for the rest of their lives, apparently, potentially. I just think that is just so important, and the power of it just really cannot be underestimated. So it's really interesting to know that is a trend that you're absolutely seeing as well. I think there's always an apprehension internally about anonymous reporting, and particularly using free text boxes. I think this year that seems to have, that fear for some reason has seemed to increase. I'm not sure why. I think it's potentially linked to the debate discussion bill going through Parliament that protects academic freedom, I think. How do you both manage that on kind of an ongoing basis? Because I think, Sarah, you said before that it's something that keeps coming up and keeps getting sort of discussed and questioned. So how do you manage that pushback, and what is the general perception of it within your institutions? I'll come to you first, Sarah.
I think I think it's worth acknowledging that there's always a lot of fear surrounding this work, and a lot of anxiety about what's right, what's wrong, um, what's legal, what's GDPR compliant. Uh, this is another area where actually I think anonymous reporting and free text boxes are helpful, and they shouldn't be creating anxiety, because people are able to ask for what they need quite specifically, without necessarily needing a thorough investigation or for the institution to take action. So it allows you.
Oh, I think Sarah's internet's cut out there. Was that
That's for us as well, Gemma.
Yeah.
All right, Nicola, I'll whilst we wait for her internet to kick back in, for her to put a coin in the meter, Nicola, can I come to the same question to you? So how do you sort of manage the ongoing nervousness, as Sarah put it so well, around free text boxes in anonymous reports?
Yeah, so I think as a starting point, it's fair to say that there was an incredible amount of anxiety about introducing that at this institution initially. And I think we have managed to decrease some of that anxiety over time, purely again from reflecting on what this data actually looks like. So I suppose, again, starting with the really obvious one of we're going to get lots of vexatious reports. We just haven't seen that. What we've seen is actually probably a very steady amount that would have reflected what would have landed in miscellaneous inboxes before. And actually, one of the things that we have been able to manage people's anxiety is to say, isn't it better now that they land in a system? And actually, we're not seeing an increase, but what we're seeing is that they're in the right place, instead of, in this age of social media, before vexatious complaints got made on Twitter, on our Facebook pages, submitted through our Instagram feed. So actually, now that we're providing, we always refer to report and support as our big red button. It's our sort of like letting students know that you can just hit this button and we'll figure it out with you. And it is almost that sense of saying, put it here. And I suppose, again, it's internally really important to say, like, we don't ever label anything vexatious. We don't refer to vexatious complaints in our disciplinary processes, because we understand that things are often much more complicated. And again, it's fair to say, I think somebody has referenced in the chat, and I would absolutely echo, often the things that seem vexatious actually are problems in themselves that need support. So again, we've said it's a good thing when we do get what some people might call a vexatious report, because it still helps us to uncover something, and it still helps us to support people. The other big anxiety, goes without saying, is about natural justice, right to respond, making sure that we're giving people due process. But again, we've been able to manage that by just explaining exactly what we've already spoken about a little bit today, about there is still due process. We don't take action appropriately. We are very clear about what we can and cannot do. Again, we introduced duty of care guidance that's on report and support that makes very clear to say, we probably won't be able to carry out a regulation and investigation on an anonymous report, but here's where we might. So we're very clear to give ourselves enough wiggle room to act when we do need to act. The other big fear is that we would open the floodgates and that we would just get overwhelmed by reports. And again, I think the honest response to how we manage that is that we did open the floodgates and we did get a lot more reports, and that's a good thing. And I think that what I would say to any other institution that might fear that as an apprehension from their institution is that it's one to be really honest about, that it will happen. But it doesn't mean that it's happening more. It just means that you've got your finger on the pulse. And again, going back to my start of the time at higher education was when The Guardian was still printing pieces about how every university up and down the country was saying they'd had less than 5 incidents of anything going wrong ever. And I'm really pleased we're not in that space anymore. And I don't think that any institution can say that it's a bad thing to open the floodgates. And in terms of how we manage free text box, we've taken the decision to just be very open. So our intro text to the free text box just says, tell us what you want to tell us. tell us whatever you're comfortable to. We don't do any kind of restricting and saying, don't tell us what their name is, don't tell us anything we might have to redact, because again, we want to have that big red button approach to say, you just do what you need to do, and it's on us to figure out the rest. It's on us to figure out how we manage that data, what's GDPR compliant. We don't want our students to have to worry about what they're meant to tell us and what they're not meant to tell us. We just want them to come to us.
That's really, really interesting, because it's something that it's the naming of an alleged perpetrator, and what the institution then does with that information is something that is, you know, really drives anxiety across the sector. So it's really interesting that you've you know, allowed that and not kind of put any off-putting kind of please don't do this messaging around it. I think that's really interesting, and I'll pick up on that in my next question. But I think we have Sarah back. Are you okay, Sarah? Can you hear me? Oh, do you know what? I don't think she is. Oh dear. Okay, well, so let's talk about that. The naming of sort of alleged perpetrators. Does it happen often, or do you, and what do you do when it happens?
So no, it doesn't. It's very rare for somebody to name somebody in an anonymous report in our experience. When they do, frankly, we tend to know about the situation already, and it tends to be that somebody is coming forward in support of a report that we're already aware of, saying, I know that you're investigating this person, and I want you to know that this is legitimate, that he did something similar to me or she did something similar to me. So it's often people who are obviously aware of a situation, rather than us going, flipping heck, who is this person and what do we do? Mm-hmm. On the very rare occasion that has happened, we've treated it on a very case-by-case basis. So again, looking at the model of starting with risk assessment, we always start with the question of what are we looking at and what could go wrong if we don't do X, Y, or Z. So again, at the University of York, we're really lucky to have what we call student life and wellbeing, which is a bringing together of security, colleges, mental health, conduct and respect, key services, who get together twice a week to talk about our safeguarding concern cases. So if we were to have a student named in a risk heavy report, as opposed to somebody squirted tomato ketchup up the wall, but if it's a concern, then we would take it to that group, talk about whether it is known to anybody, get a sense of, is this a risky case? Is the behaviour itself enough for us to just make contact? Do we have legitimate grounds to understand that this could be something? Do we have legitimate grounds to say that it's not? So we're always assessing. We don't have a written down black and white, if you name somebody, here's what we'll do. And if you don't name somebody, here's what we'll do. And as I say, we've got policies that are available on the system to students to access to see what that wiggle room looks like, where we will have to act, where we might act and where we won't act. But what I would say is that we have had cases where we've been able to take full disciplinary action, because we've had evidence that stands on its own 2 feet, that somebody has been anonymously able to provide to us. And obviously we have many, many more cases where we would have to just mark it down as something that we may ever need to act on in future. Yeah, that is really interesting, and like just been said in the chat, really great practice to hear and share. Can I pick up on that trend of people who have made an anonymous report and then go on to make a named report? Have you got any further insight on kind of numbers around that or anything like that, or how, and you know, sort of like, have you spoken to the students about why that is, if it was appropriate to do so? Yeah, so I don't have any figures on it. I suppose it's quite a hard thing to measure. Sometimes we might not be absolutely certain that someone is a return customer as such, but others are very obvious. So just to give an idea of the scale of it, we had one case who told us they made an anonymous report in their first year, and it took them until I think about 3 weeks before they graduated to want to, oh sorry, it was a master's, so it was the beginning of their master's and the end of their master's, so it took them a long time to want to say that was me all that time ago. We had another situation just in the last few weeks where somebody took 7 minutes to change their mind and put it in with contact details, so just submitted the exact same text but said, actually I do want to say who I am. So in both of those scenarios,
that's interesting. So that wasn't a mistake. It was that literally they pressed the button, submit report on an anonymous one, and then literally moments later felt sort of empowered to put their name and contact details in. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and their narrative of that was very much the case. It wasn't oopsie, I clicked anonymous, but very much, I think, going back to what you were saying earlier, overcoming that huge obstacle of getting it out of here and writing it down for the first time is massive. And once it's done, I think there's almost the anonymous reporting offers that breath, that space to just go, okay, I've done that bit, I've got it down, I've written it, now what do I want to happen? And I think it just offers that choice-based model to say, now that it's written, do I want to come forward, yes or no, as opposed to that decision being this huge step of, and now what do I say, because it's already done. I think just flipping that narrative of saying you've got the data and now I just take this somehow smaller step in one sense of just going click, here's who I am. And again, we've had sometimes anonymous ones that we then just get a follow-up that says that was me, and that's all they write the second is they go, I just put something in, it's me, here's my email address. And I think it is just that it's easier to click that button once we've already got the information.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I really would love to do more sort of research and understanding into that, but it's obviously difficult. It's always a difficult thing for culture shift to kind of go like, how was this process? Because the process of telling someone that something terrible and traumatic has happened to you is not like, it's not great. It's a 5 out of 5. Do you know what I mean? Like of the experience. So like, what is ethically, when is it appropriate, and when is it, is it ethical to get insight on that and without the risk of re-traumatizing? Like, it's something that we really struggle with, so we do it in different ways where we can see how many people started the process and how many people eventually ended it, for example, and see like which questions seem to be putting people off, and then tweak in our best practice questions, like tweak either the wording or if it's a free text box or if it's like a multiple choice, maybe that's too overwhelming, so we'll potentially like work and tweak that. But it is a challenge, so that's just so interesting, I think. Sarah, have you joined on another device? Thank you for persisting.
Huge apologies, everybody. My broadband chose now to decide to give up.
That's it, finished for Christmas.
So I apologise, I'm on my slightly wobbly mobile phone now.
That's all right. I'm going to take some questions from our audience in a moment. But before I do, it would be really interesting to hear your examples of when you've experienced a case where anonymous disclosure has been named, where they have named an alleged perpetrator in the report, and how you went about managing that.
Okay, that's important. We tried lots of ways to kind of protect ourselves from risk while we're dealing with these kinds of cases, because they were predicted when we first got report and support. I think before, when I was talking about anxiety, I think this is one of those things where everyone is afraid. And what I was going to say before is that, some of the choices that you make can be determined by coming back to a very human perspective. We've made a point of making this a reporter-led process. So it's victim and survivor supportive at every stage. And that includes receiving the report and making determinations about the actions. So the smart thing to do always is go back and think, if this happened to a friend or a family member, if the person accused was a friend or family member, what protections and what level of investigation would you want for that person? What care would they need? I was speaking before I got cut off about how we handle cases, and I think this relates very strongly and is important, that you're making collective decisions. So much like Nicola, we kind of grew our team and curated it until we had the right people in place to make decisions about anonymity and about risk, and also care. So we have someone from wellbeing, we have someone from student support services, someone from HR, and someone from legal and governance. And then I'm an administrative support to that team, but I also have some experience with sexual violence work from my volunteer work. So we're able to kind of go around the room, make determinations about what's needed to cover all of the bases for those individual departments and areas of the institution, and then speak very humanly as well to make decisions. The other thing that's incredibly helpful, and if people aren't Gold Package members, I strongly recommend that you move forward and make the investment, because one of the most important tools in your box will be a risk assessment. Now, the form that comes from Culture Shift, it's kind of broad, but I understand it was designed with the police or with police input. That's helpful because that will cover some of your legal queries. I think it's also important to take that tool and customize it. We have different services here in London than universities might have up north. And so we're able to do slightly different checking in the risk assessment process. So if we had a named reported party and we felt as a group of people that the incident was so severe that we felt as individuals and a group that we needed to go forward and take action, even though it was an anonymous report, we would run a risk assessment process. Quite often in the free text box, if people are making anonymous reports, they do say our kind of number one hit is that they are fearful of retribution, less so of being believed, and so on. It's really that they're not often prepared to be the only person stepping forward if they think that this is more prevalent from the perpetrator or the accused party. The other thing that it allows us to do is check. So even if we feel that we're not wanting to move forward to, say, open a formal investigation against the named accused, it may be that we want to just check around that person. And that can be fantastically helpful. If, for example, the department of that accused person is named as well, we may speak to that department head and say, do you have anyone who you have any concerns about? You know, is anybody known to you who's perhaps creating issues for other students? Now, we're not having to disclose a name. We're not having to break our GDPR. It's a form of kind of jigsaw identification, and it's possible in some cases. Again, we would risk assess that first, and it's quite a thorough process. But I think it's important to just be sensible, and hopefully that will eliminate some of the fear. You know, make sure that you're doing your GDPR checks, and if necessary, we're very fortunate we have an excellent GDPR officer, so we're able to speak hypothetically about cases with that person, and then they can advise us. Equally, if you're ever unsure, many of us have referral parties, so external resources that we use. Don't forget, you can check things with them too, and say, you know, we want to be, victim survivor led. How can we help this person best? and serve them in this hypothetical situation. And, you're going to get good advice.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really important. Thank you for that. That's really, really good. I have had a few questions and comments from the people listening. So I'll come to that. I just want to pick up on Luke's point where he says there needs to be consideration when assessing the risks of the incidental impact on victims. For example, reporting a victim of sexual assault to the police without their consent, they are at higher likelihood of self-harm. And I absolutely hear that, and definitely would not advocate for going to the police based on, it needs to be, based on what the victim wants, because that would just be even further loss of consent, which would be terrible. I think I don't know whether that was said sort of in relation to the risk assessment, but it was the risk assessment was developed with a GDPR lawyer and a human rights lawyer, and that's why when Sarah talks about sort of legal compliance, it's been reviewed from that perspective. So if that was in response to that, but we would definitely never advocate for people to just go to the police. Okay, so there's a question that was asked fairly early on, which is from Zoe at the Open University, and she says, for a number of reasons, the Open University have decided not to include a free text box in their anonymous reporting route. How do others deal with safeguarding or prevent issues if something is disclosed but no action can be taken? I will go to Nicola first.
Yeah, so I think, I guess the phrase I would question is no action can be taken. I think that's one of the things that we really quickly addressed here when we introduced anonymous reporting is what do we mean by no action? And I think not to speak to what Zoe might mean, but I think we quickly moved away from no action as a concept, because actually what we were meaning is no investigation, no internal misconduct finding, and actually starting to address there's always some action that can be taken, but it might not be what we've classically thought of as action. So actually using prevent issue as a really good example. We quite often get information that we know the police may well be interested in, but we might have a concern over, is it safe for us to pass that on? Is that going to put a potential victim more at risk? Is it going to put the alleged reported person more at risk? Because again, bear in mind that we do have a duty of care to all of our students. We don't know why somebody might be making an anonymous report, and as much as vexatious complaints are very unusual, they do happen. So we're very careful not to heighten risk by passing on information, but we have a very good relationship with our local police service, including a woman who's in charge of anonymous intelligence. So one of the things, to echo what was just said, use your partners. We very often just touch base with our prevent lead in the area, with our anonymous police intel lead in the area to say, if someone was to have told us this, what would that look like? The flip side of that is that sometimes they ask us for information that we say, we're not going to give that to you. So we, again, as an anonymous case example, we had someone that said to us, something very terrible has happened. You need to go to this address. You need to go there and you'll see what I mean. It was not a student accommodation that we were responsible for. It was a place of public interest. And so we handed that address to the police, but when they said, you need to tell us how you got this information, who it might be from, what you know, we said, no, that is all you're getting from us. So again, that was done on very much a risk-based decision of, we didn't feel like we could manage based on what else had been said as part of that report. We felt like we had an obligation under prevent to pass that on, but we still took decisions to not share everything that had been said to us because we thought that would put people more at risk.
That's really interesting, really, really interesting. Sarah, have you got any insight into sort of how you deal with safeguarding or prevent issues if they're disclosed but you haven't, it's been through anonymous route?
Yes, actually we had a case that was just It was really interesting. It's made an excellent case study, and it's an incident that was fairly serious, anonymously reported with a named accused. And we ran a risk assessment to determine whether or not we would contact the named accused, because that's our general policy, which is that if someone is named in a report, that they have a right to know and they have a right to access support services and have, well-being support and perhaps academic support, whatever it is that they need, offered to them, because that can be really traumatic as well. And it allowed us to get to the bottom of a deeper issue, which is that that person actually needed ongoing support. And it turned out to be helpful. They were happy that we got in touch with them. They were mortified that their behavior had been so affecting on another student. They were really, upset. We also have cases, of course, where we would make contingency plans and safety plans for anyone who makes a report. Now, with an anonymous report, you're not necessarily able to do that. So we had to do a very thorough risk assessment before we made that decision. And that's not necessarily something that I think would be an outcome in every one of those cases. This was quite an outlier, but it allowed us to touch base with someone who really needed help. So there's definitely benefits to following up. And I agree with Nicola that no action isn't no action. It is not being able to make an investigation. We try also to make that very clear at the beginning of the process for people. And I don't know if during my my technological absence, if you all discussed the ability to convert reports, because that is, that's a wonderful reassurance to give to survivor victims, that they don't have to repeat themselves, that they don't have to run the risk of re-traumatizing themselves, but that they can convert their initial anonymous report over and add their information later. That's helpful to us as well in terms of collecting information and not receiving duplicate reports. And I think in this case, that helps as well with safety and well-being and support.
Yeah, so I should say that's a feature within the system that we've launched over the last year, which is that you can switch forms at the end of the report, basically. So you could, if you were reporting anonymously, you could choose to switch on named and make it named, or vice versa. So if you need, I think most people know about that feature, but if not, then please obviously speak to Rebecca or Sarah, your relationship manager. We have got another question from Sam at the University of Manchester, which is really interesting because of a feature that we're currently working on. So she says, in terms of monitoring what comes through anonymous reporting, what processes do you use to track and identify those patterns, for instance, in location or where a person may be named and then might be named again? And just before you answer about how you deal with that kind of today, we are currently testing a feature that we're calling multiple mentions, and that is when the university can tag cases that they think are potentially linked, either because of the information that's been told, so when we first started developing it, it was going to kind of be reliant on the caseworker going, this seems familiar, I'll tag it. We are using AI to help so that the system can tag those reports, flag that to the administrator and say, these two reports look like they've got similar information in them. And then you can choose to agree, yes, looks like it's a similar incident or similar perpetrator, so we're going to tag those reports and investigate them together, or say, no, system, you've got it wrong, and it will learn. So yeah, just to mention that is in testing and going to be launched over the coming months. So when, but if I could go to how you do that today, then how do you kind of keep track of those similar cases? And I'll come to Nicola first.
First of all, that sounds magical, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. The honest answer at York at the moment is a lot of it is done through, I mentioned our Students of Concern group, which is a group that meets twice a week. So that is a space where we have a very locked down system run by our mental health team called PC-MIS, where we have a completely confidential record of any student that we've identified as high risk. You can imagine a lot of those are those who are either reporting or reported parties in cases like this. So we run names through that group all the time. In terms of similar sounding situations where we might not have named parties, we primarily do use that same group, as well as just that anecdotal shared wisdom of somebody going, I know this one. I think, to be honest, it's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing with remote working. There's no longer the tap on the shoulder culture, the overheard phone call that a member of a team can go, that sounds like a conversation I just had with the department. But it is something that we're looking at the minute, is how we make sure that things don't slip through that kind of human net, but that group is one of the ways that we do that, to make sure that the key people who have oversight of vulnerable and at-risk students are looking at those sort of situations going, does anybody know about this one, is one of the most used sentences in that room. Yeah, definitely. Sarah, how are you tracking and identifying similar cases at the moment?
Again, this falls down to regular review of data. Certainly if you're trying to identify departments or literal physical spaces where there's higher risk for people because, greater number of incidences, you can pick that up, I think, in all of the data categories that fall on which department that person is reporting from. The other thing that's been incredibly helpful, thank you, Culture Shift, because you can kind of do a more manual version of what's coming down the pike by doing keyword search. We no longer have to rely on our foggy memories to say, oh, I think we heard about this person last year, and it also future proofs, because, not all of us are going to be in our job roles forever. It's incredibly important that the work exceeds our time in our roles. So, and it is as kind of foolproof, for want of a better term. So what we can do now is, if we have a name, for example, you can run it as a keyword search, and it will ping back all of the cases that have that person's name in them from over the years, which is unbelievably valuable. Obviously, use your own data protection policies to determine how long that information is being kept for, and be sensible. Just because you have someone who had an incident previously, it doesn't necessarily imply guilt at this stage, but it also may mean that they need assistance too. So yeah, we look at the data.
Yeah, that's good, and I'm glad that text box search has been used and is useful. Sam says, thanks all, agree, the new AI sounds good. We're struggling on time to constantly do that data dig at the moment, and to be fair, UOM have had the system since 2017, so there's a lot of data to go through there manually, but worried that we might be missing some obvious flags that only become apparent during the scheduled data review. So yeah, hopefully that AI, which is going to be available to Gold members, will become really useful feature to everyone. I'm going to do one more call out for any questions, and then we're going to look at drawing to a close. Whilst I wait for any questions to come through, what advice would you give to anyone that maybe in this chat today that sees the benefits of anonymous reporting really wants to implement it, but is facing pushback from maybe some risk-averse people in their institution. Nicola?
So I suppose going back to something that I touched on a little bit before, is to be really honest that the risks are real, but that they're manageable. I think one of the things that helped us to get senior management buy-in was to front up to the significant anxieties that were there, to be really honest about the fact that we wouldn't be able to get rid of those risks altogether. But
Press the space bar to
Oh no, Nicola, you've just gone on mute.
narrator.
I don't know how that happened. Sorry about that. But I think the meaningful planning stage was huge for us. So actually identifying what the risks were. We have a student life committee as part of our governance structure. So we presented to them over probably a year of convincing them that this was the right move, to say, here are the risks and here's how we are going to manage them. And here's actually, as I've said before, that the huge benefits that we said and have showed have outweighed any of those risks. I think being ready for what those challenges also will mean for either yourself or any team that are responsible, to go not too off topic, I hope, but I think one of the things that I would really strongly advise as a manager of a team is to be ready for the vulnerability that the journey requires, for yourself and your team. We, as I say, we introduced the question of why are you reporting anonymously, which has been the most valuable bit of data as far as I'm concerned, but also, as I said, one of the most difficult. Going back to something that Gemma touched on before about feedback, one of the things that our students have asked us for now is a feedback process whereby reporting and reported parties can tell us how they found the process. We know that that's going to be incredibly difficult. We know that typically in a misconduct case, at least 50% of people are ticked off at you at the end of it, because it's gone a way that one of them isn't going to like, possibly both. So what we're doing at the moment is introducing hopefully some values-based feedback for people that have reported, with contact details primarily because we know how to get feedback from them, but also hopefully trying to talk to some of the people that have submitted anonymous reports to say, how did you experience all of this? How is report and support for you? How is the way that we do things? And I suppose to sort of bring it back to what you asked, Gemma, sorry to go on a bit of a tangent, but I think one of the biggest bits of advice I'd give to anybody, anywhere on the report and support journey, the anonymous reporting journey, whatever that looks like, is to be willing to be vulnerable, to be willing to be honest, because it is challenging and it is difficult, and you will be inviting people to criticize and scrutinize what you do. I think it goes without saying some of the universities that I would look at and that we probably will look at as gold standard are the ones that have been spoken the most about in media. So I think it's about being ready for the fact that it does open you up for criticism and all the rest of it. And I know anonymous reporting itself got hounded in the media this year. But I think we stand by it as something that we believe in, we see the real value of, but to be ready to, I suppose, hold on to the narrative of telling your institution why it's a good thing, telling your team why it's good to be vulnerable, and telling your students why you believe in what they're asking for as something that you want to help them to achieve.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an interesting point that you bring up about the anonymous reporting getting hounded in the media. And when I was doing, interviews with the various media outlets, it was to try and underline the fact that report and support isn't a sacking machine. Just because someone gives you information potentially anonymously doesn't mean that a lecturer or a tutor or a professor or an academic is going to be sacked automatically. There is human scrutiny about what happens, and actually what happens more often than not is not dismissal, but additional training, conversations about behavior and how to sort of improve behavior, and so that it can be a harmonious community for students and staff. And it's like we sort of tried, and I think we've managed to get the message through that a lot of reports doesn't mean that particular institution, an increase in reports doesn't mean that the behaviour is terrible at that particular institution. It is an indicator that people trust that institution to be able to handle that information and access support from that university. I think we need to keep having another conversation about the fact that, you know, it's not a automatic firing machine. So we'll keep doing that. I should say as well that interesting about asking for feedback on the process, there are a few institutions that we work with that are doing that kind of through report and support at the moment, which is London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine have a little feedback form, which is in the footer of their site, and I think Sussex and Edinburgh also have something similar. So it'll be interesting as more partners you know, try to get that feedback from reporters and, you know, reported parties in an appropriate and non-re-traumatizing way, how we can feedback on that and then improve, you know, the reporting process, but also the collective process once it's been reported. Sarah, I'll ask you the same question. What advice would you give to anyone that wants to be able to introduce anonymous reporting but is getting that pushback elsewhere in the institution?
I'm very much with Nicola about vulnerability. I think that's important because you can't be constructive or do proper reviews of your work without that. I would also recommend to people to, you know, learn about survivor victims, learn about how it is that they become likely targets and how it is that they feel going through the reporting process. And actually, post Me Too, there's a lot more discussion, a lot more resource out there to help with that. I strongly recommend reading a fantastic book about the career of a legal prosecutor called Prosecuting Sex Crime, Then and Now by Alice Vax. I can pop that in the chat later. She prosecuted sex crime in the US and the UK and talks about a concept known as good and bad victims, and where people will need extra support when they're making disclosures and when they decide to make full reports and or when they make a police report. And that's really important because that can be very different. And again, I would urge everyone to understand how intersectionality affects victim survivors, because they may need a more knowing approach, and that's worthwhile. So, you know, anyone with disability, anybody who perhaps has been targeted because they're LGBTQ+, people who are people of color, or for whom there are different cultural expectations, all of that becomes important in feeling more prepared to do a good job for that victim survivor or for somebody who is an accused party. All of these things become relevant too.
Definitely. Okay, that's amazing. I don't think we have any more questions from the audience. So that just leaves me to thank you both, Sarah from Goldsmiths and Nicola from the University of York. It was just, yeah, that was so, I really enjoyed that conversation. So I hope the people that were listening enjoyed it and got a lot out of it as well. Tomorrow's session, we'll be sharing the way that UCL and Warwick University are compiling their annual reports. So UCL, I think, they've got 2 years worth of reporting published, and you can see the latest report if you want to have a look before tomorrow's session on their report and support system. And the University of Warwick have recently published theirs. So they will be talking about that process, about what they, how they've reported in that annual report, and what, most importantly, what their action plan is off the back of kind of collecting that data. So we're really, really looking forward to that tomorrow. Thanks everyone so much. Have great days, and we'll see you all tomorrow.